We're not spending Christmas with you." Harper's voice came through the speakerphone crisp and unwavering, as though she had rehearsed every word before making the call. For a brief moment, the house seemed to fall completely silent. It wasn't only because her words hurt, although they certainly did, but because they confirmed something I had been trying not to admit to myself. I took a slow breath to steady my thoughts before answering with a calmness I knew she wouldn't expect. "That's fine," I replied. "Then Christmas is canceled." For a split second, I heard her lose her composure. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line before she quickly tried to recover. "What do you mean canceled? You can't just—" She never finished the sentence because I had already ended the call. The silence that settled over my kitchen afterward felt entirely different from the silence that follows an argument. It wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It felt clean, almost as though something heavy had finally been lifted away. I placed my phone on the counter and looked at the neat stacks of paperwork spread across the kitchen table. Catering confirmations were clipped together, rental agreements had been highlighted, lighting schedules were carefully marked, and every vendor's information had been organized with the precision I always brought to family holidays. Every contract carried my signature. Every deposit had been charged to my credit card. Every arrangement existed because I had made it happen. Yet somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that the celebration belonged to everyone except me. My eyes settled on the catering invoice lying near the top of the pile. The total stood out in bold print, impossible to ignore. I remembered agreeing to it without hesitation, because it seemed easier to handle the expense myself than to listen to Harper complain about how difficult everything had become. Like so many other decisions over the years, I had told myself I was doing it for family. Looking back now, I realized I had been carrying Christmas for so long that I no longer noticed how heavy it had become, until the moment I finally chose to set it down. Morning sunlight slowly stretched across the kitchen counter, illuminating every folder and every receipt, as though quietly reminding me where all of it had come from. The food, the decorations, the rented equipment, the staff, and every carefully planned detail existed because I had created them. For the first time, however, another thought settled into my mind. What would happen if I simply stepped aside and stopped holding everything together? That question stayed with me as I gathered the paperwork into a single organized stack. I rested both hands on it for a moment while memories drifted back not in overwhelming waves, but gently enough to remind me how I had arrived here in the first place. I had never deliberately chosen to become the person responsible for every family holiday. Instead, I had slipped into that role little by little after Alex's father passed away when my son was still young, and I was doing everything I could to make our lives feel stable despite the uncertainty surrounding us. Being a single mother taught me how to create order even when life felt anything but orderly. Alex depended on that stability, and in many ways, I depended on it too. As the years passed, the people around us gradually grew accustomed to my reliability, until eventually they stopped noticing it altogether. When Alex married Harper, I welcomed her into the family without hesitation. I imagined we would naturally blend our traditions and create new ones together, but the changes began almost immediately. At first, they came as small observations wrapped in polite smiles. Harper would suggest that my traditions felt outdated, or explain that modern gatherings needed a more carefully curated appearance. Yet every elegant centerpiece she admired, every elaborate menu she proudly presented, and every decorative theme she claimed as her own somehow began with my time, my planning, and my money. None of that seemed worth arguing about. Recognition had never been important to me, and I believed keeping the peace mattered far more than receiving credit. Whenever something slipped through the cracks, I quietly stepped in. Whenever Harper announced a decision that relied on work I had already done, I nodded and let it pass. Over time, however, what I thought was peace slowly transformed into something far less balanced. Alex always tried to avoid conflict. Whenever tension surfaced, he would gently remind us that everyone was stressed or suggest we not turn small issues into bigger ones. He believed he was remaining neutral, but after enough years, his neutrality became another form of silence. Harper continued making decisions without asking, telling guests I would cover expenses or rearranging plans with complete confidence that I would adjust everything behind the scenes. and every single time I did exactly that. Looking back across the invoices spread before me, I finally recognized the pattern with complete clarity. Every time something threatened to fall apart, I caught it before anyone else noticed. Eventually, they stopped worrying about whether anything could fail because they assumed I would always be there to make sure it didn't. As I pressed the papers into one final neat stack, I realized the next step had already begun taking shape long before I stood up from the table. 3 days passed beneath an uneasy silence before my phone rang again. Harper's name appeared on the screen, and by the time I answered, I already knew what kind of conversation was coming. Her voice sounded calm, polished, and carefully controlled, as though nothing unpleasant had happened between us. "We've decided to keep the guest list smaller this year," she said, "so you don't need to come." There was no hesitation in her tone, and certainly no apology. She simply announced my removal from Christmas, as though she were adjusting a seating chart instead of excluding the person who had carried the entire celebration for decades. Then she continued describing the menu, the seating arrangement, and the elegant theme she wanted this year. Every detail she mentioned was one I had selected, organized, or already paid deposits for, yet she spoke as though she had built the entire event herself. Somewhere in the background, I heard Alex say something quietly. His voice was too faint to make out the words, and Harper ignored him completely before continuing exactly where she had left off. When she finally stopped speaking, I didn't rush to fill the silence. There was nothing left to explain. "I hope you understand," she said lightly before ending the call. I stood quietly for a moment before walking into the dining room, letting my eyes drift across everything around me. The long oak table had been purchased the year Alex moved into his first apartment, because I imagined one day he would return with a family of his own. I remembered assembling each chair on a cold winter afternoon, while an old radio station played Christmas music in the background. Along one wall sat neatly stacked storage bins filled with ornaments, serving dishes, table linens, and strings of lights that I had collected over the years. Every piece had been chosen, carefully paid for by me, and used year after year until it had quietly become part of our family's traditions. None of those things were valuable because of sentiment alone. They represented years of planning, preparation, and quiet consistency. Yet despite everything they symbolized, I had somehow been written out of the celebration they were meant to support. I walked into my study, opened my laptop, and watched the familiar tabs load across the screen. Catering confirmations, rental agreements, delivery schedules, staffing arrangements, and vendor invoices appeared one after another. Every document listed my name as the billing contact. Every contract identified me as the authorized signer, and every financial obligation rested squarely on my shoulders. The more pages I reviewed, the clearer one truth became. They expected the entire holiday to move forward exactly as planned, even though they no longer expected me to be part of it. I slowly closed the laptop and rested both hands on the desk for a few moments. The decision forming inside me no longer felt emotional. It felt practical. The following morning, I spread every contract neatly across the kitchen table, the way someone might arrange puzzle pieces before taking them apart. I reached for the first phone number in the stack and called the catering company I'd worked with for years. "I need to cancel the order for December 25th, I said. The representative confirmed my name, located the reservation, and politely informed me that everything would be processed that afternoon. There were no questions about why I was canceling, no attempts to persuade me otherwise, and no unnecessary conversation. The linen rental company handled the cancellation just as efficiently. The staffing agency did the same, followed by the lighting company Harper had insisted on because it created the elegant atmosphere she wanted. One by one, every arrangement disappeared with nothing more than a brief phone call. When the final cancellation was complete, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a slow breath. What settled over me wasn't excitement or satisfaction. It was something steadier than either of those emotions. For the first time in years, Christmas no longer felt like a responsibility that belonged to everyone else while resting entirely on my shoulders. Before long, my phone began buzzing with messages from relatives. One cousin wanted to know what time dinner would begin. An aunt asked what dish she should bring. Someone else wondered whether I still needed extra folding chairs. I looked at each message without answering. Their questions weren't unreasonable. They simply reflected the same assumption everyone had carried for years, that I would organize everything, because I always had. As the messages continued arriving, I realized just how invisible my work had become. People no longer noticed the effort because they assumed the holiday assembled itself. I placed the phone face down beside the paperwork and looked around my quiet living room. Gradually, another picture began taking shape in my mind. Instead of endless schedules, delivery trucks, and carefully managed expectations, I imagined something much simpler: a pot of soup simmering gently on the stove, a handful of people gathered around my own table, and conversations that didn't need to impress anyone. It wouldn't be a performance or a production. It would simply be Christmas. That thought stayed with me as I gathered the last canceled contract into a neat stack. By late afternoon, I knew it was time to say exactly what needed to be said. I opened the family group chat, the same conversation where I had spent years sending reminders, coordinating schedules, and quietly holding every detail together, and typed a single message. Plans have changed. I won't be organizing the family Christmas this year. I'll be hosting a small gathering at my home instead, and anyone who would like to join me is warmly welcome. I read the message twice to make sure there were no apologies hidden between the words. Then I pressed send. The responses appeared almost immediately. One cousin replied first. "Honestly, that sounds lovely." A few seconds later, my aunt wrote that she'd always enjoyed spending Christmas at my house anyway. Another relative admitted that the larger gathering had become difficult to attend every year, and that my invitation actually worked better for their schedule. As I continued reading through the conversation, I noticed something that genuinely surprised me. There was relief, curiosity, and quiet support, but there was no outrage. Not a single person accused me of ruining Christmas, and no one questioned why I wasn't attending Harper's gathering. Several relatives even hinted in their own gentle way that what they appreciated most about the holidays had never been the decorations or the elaborate menu. It had always been the atmosphere I created. Before I had time to finish reading the messages, my phone lit up with Alex's name. I watched it ring until it stopped. A text followed almost immediately. "Mom, can we talk?" Then came another phone call. I let that one go unanswered as well before placing my phone face down on the dining table. A few minutes later, another notification appeared, this time from Harper. "You caused confusion. Fix it." The message was short, direct, and written with the same certainty she always used whenever she expected me to solve a problem she believed belonged to me. For a brief moment, I felt the familiar instinct rise inside me, the old habit of smoothing things over before anyone became upset. For years, that reflex had become almost automatic. Whenever tension appeared, I stepped in. Whenever something threatened to unravel, I quietly stitched it back together. This time I remained exactly where I was. My hands rested lightly on the table as I looked out across the quiet room, allowing the silence to settle around me instead of rushing to fill it. The stillness felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable at first, but beneath that discomfort was something much steadier. I realized I didn't have to repair a situation I hadn't created, and I didn't have to answer demands simply because someone expected me to. The phone vibrated again. I ignored it. A little after sunset, someone knocked sharply on my front door. The sound was firm and impatient, exactly the way I imagined it would be. When I opened the door, Harper stood on the porch with her coat hanging open and her hair slightly windblown from the cold evening air. Her expression was carefully controlled, but the anger beneath it was impossible to miss. "You embarrassed me," she said before I could even greet her. "Everything is falling apart." She hadn't come to ask questions. She had come to regain control. Without saying anything, I stepped back just enough to stand comfortably inside the doorway while leaving the threshold between us. "What exactly is falling apart?" I asked calmly. She exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated that I wasn't responding the way she expected. "The vendors, the deliveries people calling to ask what's happening. You knew canceling everything would create a disaster." I met her gaze without raising my voice. "Every one of those reservations was made under my name, and every payment came from my accounts. I canceled services that belonged to me." "You acted out of emotion," she shot back. "I acted according to the contracts." For a moment, she simply stared at me. Her eyes drifted past my shoulder into the quiet house, as though she expected to find evidence that would somehow shift the conversation back in her favor. Instead, she found exactly what surrounded me now: peace. A few footsteps sounded along the walkway. Alex approached slowly, his hands buried inside his jacket pockets, and tension written across his face. He looked from Harper to me before speaking in a voice that sounded far more uncertain than hers. "Mom, can we talk?" Before I could answer, Harper turned toward him. "You told me you'd take care of this." "I'm trying," he replied quietly, though even he didn't sound convinced. The three of us stood in silence for several moments. Harper was still trying to force everything back into the familiar pattern where I quietly absorbed every responsibility. Alex remained caught between the instinct to avoid conflict and the growing realization that things had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. As for me, I stayed exactly where I was, neither angry nor defensive, simply unwilling to return to the role I had played for so many years. As I watched Harper's expression, I noticed the anger slowly giving way to something else. Recognition. She had never truly wanted me excluded from Christmas. She had wanted me invisible, useful, reliable, always available. She expected me to keep carrying the entire celebration while quietly stepping aside so someone else could receive the credit. Now that I had stopped doing that, she no longer knew how to keep everything together. The silence between us stretched until another voice called Harper's name from the driveway. She straightened her coat, gathered what remained of her composure, and walked away without another word. Over the next 2 days, the change spread quietly through the family. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public arguments, and no lengthy discussions in the group chat. Instead, individual messages began arriving one after another. A cousin wanted to know whether everything was all right. An uncle asked who had usually handled the holiday arrangements in previous years. One of my aunts wondered if I had always been the person responsible for transportation decorating and cleaning after everyone left. None of them sounded accusatory. They simply sounded curious. As I answered their questions honestly, something interesting happened. Piece by piece, they began assembling the pattern I had lived with for years. They realized that I had arranged the vendors, managed the schedules, coordinated the deliveries, covered unexpected expenses, and quietly solved every problem before anyone else even noticed it existed. For the first time, the work I had always done was no longer invisible. People weren't offering pity. They were simply recognizing the truth. Late on the third evening, another knock sounded at my front door. This time it was Alex. He hadn't called ahead or sent a message to ask whether I was home. He simply stood on the porch with his shoulders slightly hunched, looking more uncertain than I had seen him in years. When I opened the door, he offered a quiet thank you as he stepped inside, then slowly looked around the living room as though he were seeing it differently for the first time. We settled into our usual chairs without rushing to fill the silence. Alex ran a hand through his hair, a habit he'd had since childhood whenever he struggled to find the right words. "Mom," he began quietly, "I didn't realize." He stopped there. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't have to. I already understood what he meant. For several minutes, he spoke more honestly than he had in a long time. He admitted that he had always assumed Christmas simply came together on its own because Harper insisted she had everything under control. Whenever I stepped in to solve a problem, he believed I was doing it because I enjoyed organizing everything, never because the entire celebration depended on me quietly holding every piece together. As he spoke, I could hear genuine surprise in his voice, the kind that comes when someone finally sees something that had been in front of them all along. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't list every sacrifice I'd made, or remind him of the years I'd spent carrying responsibilities no one else acknowledged. Instead, I simply told him the one thing I had finally learned myself. I'm not going back to the way things were. He lowered his eyes for a moment before slowly nodding. I know. There was disappointment in his expression, but not because he expected me to change my mind. It came from realizing how much he had failed to notice for so many years. After another few quiet moments, he thanked me for listening and walked to the front door. I watched him leave without trying to stop him because some conversations need time to settle before they can truly change anything. Christmas morning arrived with a peace I hadn't experienced in years. There were no alarms reminding me of deliveries, no lists taped to the refrigerator, and no constant stream of phone calls asking where something belonged or what still needed to be done. Instead, I moved through the morning at my own pace. A pot of soup simmered gently on the stove. Soft music drifted through the house, and sunlight filtered across the dining room table that had once been surrounded by endless schedules and expectations. Shortly after noon, the first knock came. One of my cousins stood on the porch holding a homemade casserole, looking almost apologetic as she asked whether she'd arrived too early. I smiled, welcomed her inside, and within the next hour, 2 aunts, an uncle, and even my next-door neighbor stopped by. None of them came because they felt obligated to appear at a carefully planned event. They came because they genuinely wanted to spend part of the day together. The atmosphere inside my home quickly became something entirely different from the elaborate celebrations Harper always preferred. Someone quietly arranged plates on the table without being asked. Another relative carried extra chairs into the dining room while my aunt stirred the soup as I sliced fresh bread. Conversations flowed naturally from one topic to another. Laughter rose and faded without anyone worrying whether every detail looked perfect, and the afternoon unfolded without a rigid schedule or endless instructions. As I watched everyone helping one another so effortlessly, I realized how different this gathering felt from the holidays I'd spent organizing for so many years. There was no invisible burden resting on one person's shoulders. Everyone contributed in small ways because they wanted to, not because someone had assigned them a task. That simple difference changed the entire feeling of the day. For years, I had confused being indispensable with being appreciated. Now I understood they weren't the same thing. Being appreciated invites people to share the work. Being indispensable often means quietly carrying everything alone until no one notices the weight anymore. Late in the afternoon, another gentle knock echoed through the house. When I opened the door, Alex stood there holding a small wrapped gift. He looked uncertain for only a moment before offering a quiet smile and stepping inside. There were no dramatic apologies and no long speeches waiting to be delivered. Instead, he slipped off his coat, carried the gift to a side table, and walked straight into the kitchen where he picked up a ladle and began serving soup to everyone else, as naturally as though he had always belonged there. No one made a scene. No one commented on his arrival. The conversation simply continued. Throughout the afternoon, he cleared empty plates, refilled coffee cups, and helped wherever he noticed something needed to be done. Watching him move quietly around the room, I couldn't help noticing the difference. For the first time in years, he wasn't standing on the sidelines trying to keep everyone else happy. He was simply participating. After most of our guests had gone home, the two of us remained in the kitchen, finishing the last few dishes. He washed while I dried, and although we barely spoke about everything that had happened over the previous weeks, we didn't need to. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt understanding. As evening settled outside the windows and the last plate was returned to its place, I realized that something important had changed. The holiday hadn't become smaller because I stopped carrying it alone. If anything, it had become warmer, more honest, and far more peaceful than the carefully orchestrated celebrations I had spent years exhausting myself to create. Without anyone announcing it, a new tradition had quietly begun. By the time the last guest stepped outside and the front door closed softly behind them, the house had settled into a peaceful quiet that felt completely different from the exhaustion I usually experienced after Christmas. The dishes had been washed, the counters were clean, and the chairs had been pushed neatly back beneath the table. Only a few small reminders of the afternoon remained: a folded napkin someone had forgotten beside a plate, a serving dish cooling near the stove, and the lingering warmth of conversations that had filled every room only a short while earlier. I lowered myself onto the sofa and looked around the living room, illuminated only by the soft glow of the Christmas lights I'd chosen for myself. There was nothing extravagant about the decorations. They weren't designed to impress anyone or create the perfect photograph. They simply made the house feel welcoming, comfortable, and honest. As I sat there enjoying the silence, I found myself thinking about how easily I had confused being needed with being valued for so many years. I had always believed that if I worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, and quietly solved every problem before anyone noticed it, the effort itself would strengthen our relationships. Looking back, I realized that usefulness and belonging are not the same thing. Usefulness can become expected. It can be assigned, relied upon, and eventually taken for granted. Belonging is different. It doesn't require constant sacrifice to prove its worth. It simply exists because people genuinely want your presence, not merely your work, or... Those thoughts stayed with me long after the house had grown completely still. For the first time in many years, I understood that I hadn't canceled Christmas at all. What I had really ended was the version of myself who believed her value depended entirely on how much she could give while asking for nothing in return. I had finally let go of the woman who carried every responsibility in silence so everyone else could enjoy the celebration without ever noticing what it cost her. The boundaries I had drawn over the past few weeks no longer felt harsh or dramatic. They didn't resemble walls built out of anger or punishment. Instead, they felt like something much healthier, a slow, deliberate return to myself after years of disappearing behind everyone else's expectations. Setting those boundaries hadn't pushed the people who truly cared about me away. If anything, it had allowed the genuine relationships in my life to become stronger because they were no longer built on obligation. Before leaving earlier that evening, Alex had hugged me quietly at the front door. He hadn't offered grand promises or emotional speeches, and I was grateful for that. Instead, his embrace carried something much more meaningful. It carried recognition. For the first time, he had seen the work I had been doing for years, and while that realization couldn't erase the past overnight, it gave me hope that the future could be different. I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself one last cup of tea before standing by the window. Outside, the neighborhood rested peacefully beneath the glow of Christmas lights, and inside my own home, everything felt calm, in a way I hadn't experienced for a very long time. The holiday hadn't been larger or more elaborate than previous years, but it had been more genuine than any celebration I could remember. The following morning, my phone remained unusually quiet. There were no frantic messages asking where supplies had gone or why vendors had failed to arrive. Instead, one by one, relatives began sending simple notes thanking me for opening my home. A cousin told me she hadn't realized how relaxed Christmas could feel until this year. My aunt admitted she enjoyed conversations that weren't constantly interrupted by schedules and last-minute problems. Even my neighbor thanked me for including her, saying it had been the warmest holiday gathering she'd attended in years. As I read each message, I noticed they all had something in common. Not one person mentioned the decorations. Not one complimented the menu. Not one talked about how impressive everything had looked. Instead, they all spoke about how welcome they had felt. That difference mattered more than any elaborate centerpiece ever could. 2 days later, Alex called again. This time I answered. We spoke quietly for nearly half an hour, not about the argument that canceled vendors or Harper's disappointment, but about ordinary things. He asked for my soup recipe because several relatives had mentioned how much they enjoyed it, and he laughed as I reminded him that he'd spent half his childhood insisting he hated homemade vegetable soup. Before ending the call, he grew quiet for a moment. I've been thinking a lot, he admitted. I know. I should have noticed sooner. I smiled gently, even though he couldn't see me. The important thing is that you notice now. Neither of us tried to force the conversation beyond that. Some changes happen through long speeches, but others begin with a single, honest acknowledgement. As I placed my phone back on the kitchen counter, I realized that Christmas hadn't ended with a dramatic reconciliation or a perfect resolution. It had ended with something much more meaningful. The truth had finally become visible. And once people truly see the work someone has quietly carried for years, it's very difficult to pretend it was never there at all. The weeks after Christmas passed with a calm I hadn't realized I was missing. For the first time in years, January didn't begin with exhaustion or quiet resentment. There were no leftover bills waiting to be paid on my credit card, No decorations to return on someone else's schedule, and no lingering feeling that I had spent weeks creating a celebration only to disappear into the background once it finally arrived. My home returned to its ordinary rhythm, and instead of feeling empty after the holidays, it felt peaceful. News about Harper's gathering reached me gradually through relatives rather than gossip. Once the catering had been canceled, the rental equipment returned, and the service staff disappeared from the schedule she had tried to reorganize everything herself. It turned out to be far more difficult than she expected. The menu became much simpler. Several guests quietly declined the invitation after accepting mine instead, and by Christmas afternoon, the large celebration she had imagined looked nothing like the polished event she had spent months describing. No one mocked her. No one celebrated her disappointment. Most people simply recognized something they had overlooked for years. The holidays had never come together because of beautiful decorations or carefully chosen themes. They had succeeded because someone quietly handled every unseen detail before anyone else noticed it needed attention. A few weeks later, Alex stopped by again. This visit felt different from every conversation we'd shared since Christmas, because there was no tension waiting beneath the surface. We made coffee, sat by the living room window, and talked about ordinary things until he finally looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen on his face. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said quietly. "So have I." He smiled faintly before continuing. "I think he always knew what you were carrying." The word stayed with me for a moment. "I think he did too." Alex lowered his eyes to his coffee cup before speaking again. "I spent so many years believing traditions simply happened. I never asked who planned them, who paid for them, or who stayed behind after everyone went home to put everything back together. I just assumed Christmas appeared every year because it always had." I reached across the table and rested my hand gently over his. "That's how invisible work becomes," I said. "People only notice it after it stops." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry it took me this long." "I know." There wasn't anything else that needed to be said. Some apologies become meaningful not because of the number of words they contain, but because the person saying them has finally understood what they never saw before. As winter slowly gave way to spring, our relationship continued changing in quiet, ordinary ways. Alex called more often not because he needed something, but because he genuinely wanted to talk. Sometimes we met for lunch. Other times he stopped by to help trim the hedges or replace a loose fence board before sharing a simple meal together. We never returned to the conversation about canceled Christmas because we didn't have to. The lesson remained present in everything that came afterward. Harper stayed distant for several months. Eventually, she sent me a brief message. "I understand now that I expected more from you than I should have." It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of everything that had happened, but it was honest. I replied with only a few words. "I hope we both learned something valuable." That was enough. Life doesn't always repair every relationship completely, but it can still restore peace when people are willing to respect boundaries they once ignored. Looking back now, I realize I never canceled Christmas. I canceled the expectation that my love had to be proven through endless sacrifice. I stopped believing that keeping everyone else comfortable required making myself invisible, and I finally understood that traditions aren't held together by decorations, expensive meals, or perfectly coordinated schedules. They're held together by the people willing to give their time, their energy, and their hearts without asking for recognition. The difference is that those people deserve recognition anyway. These days, when Christmas approaches, I still decorate my home, prepare meals, and welcome anyone who wants to spend the day with me. The celebration is smaller than it once was, but it feels warmer because everyone who walks through my front door comes to share the day, not to hand me another responsibility. The work is shared, the conversations are genuine, and no one mistakes kindness for obligation anymore. As I switch on the lights each December and watch their warm glow fill the house, I'm reminded that the brightest traditions aren't the ones built on perfection. They're the ones built on respect, gratitude, and the quiet understanding that no single person should have to carry the entire weight of a family's happiness alone. Looking back now, I don't believe the most important moment was the day I canceled Christmas, or even the evening Harper stood at my front door, demanding that I fix everything. Those moments simply revealed a truth that had been quietly growing for years. I had mistaken carrying every responsibility for being loved, when in reality the two are not the same. The people who truly value you don't measure your worth by how much you sacrifice for them. They value your presence, your kindness, and your willingness to share life together, not your ability to quietly solve every problem behind the scenes. For many years, I believed keeping the peace meant saying yes, stepping in whenever something fell apart, and making myself smaller so everyone else could enjoy the holiday. What I finally learned was that peace built on one person's endless sacrifice isn't peace at all. It's simply exhaustion wearing a smile. The moment I stopped carrying everything alone, the people around me were finally able to see the invisible work that had always held our family traditions together. If my story leaves you with one lesson, I hope it's this: never be afraid to set boundaries around your kindness. The people who truly love you may not understand those boundaries immediately, but they will eventually learn to respect them. Those who become angry because you stop doing everything for them often reveal that they appreciated your usefulness more than they appreciated you. Real family isn't built on obligation. It's built on gratitude, shared responsibility, and the willingness to stand beside one another instead of expecting one person to carry the weight alone. I didn't cancel Christmas that year. I simply stopped disappearing inside it. And when I finally allowed myself to be seen instead of merely being useful, I discovered that the warmest traditions are never created by perfect decorations or expensive celebrations. They are created by people who choose to love, respect, and support one another equally, and that is the only tradition truly worth protecting.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful: love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.